All right, I'm here with Dr. Richard Katz. Now, Richard, do you prefer Richard or Dick?
Dick is, yeah. The only one that called me Richard was my mom.
Okay.
You've heard that before.
But it's part of your professional title, I guess,
I
and
know.
so
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
what we've read.
Yeah.
Um, First of all, thanks for joining me today. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a few years now.
Yeah. Well, it's good to be here. It's good to see you. Yeah.
Yeah, likewise. Now, maybe a good place to begin is if you could just let people know where in the world you are and just give us a sense of place and time where you're calling from.
Sure. I love to do that because we're here in Saskatchewan, Canada. Um, Beautiful place, prairie, a lot of bush. Right outside my living room window is a park with all sorts of beautiful trees. And right outside my window is a an elm tree. We have a lot of elm trees here. And one of the things I do is I sit in my rocking chair in the morning and I look out at that tree. Hasn't moved to the last 10 years, but it's a teacher because that tree has been um, trimmed by the city. The limbs have been trimmed because they don't want a tree to fall on the electrical wires and things like that. And I looked at that tree about 2 years ago. I realized that tree was not trimmed; it was amputated. The
Mm.
tree has it's amputated limbs because every branch of that tree has a purpose of getting more light and more rain. So it was going in a certain direction according to its nature, and humans came along and trimmed it. So I look at that tree and I think about that. The difference between the human perspective of trimming the tree and the tree's perspective of being amputated and then still going on. So we live
Mm.
in a town called Saskatoon. It has a lot of parks like that. And out here on the prairie, I'm a city boy who grew up in the city, the East Coast in the States. So I really love being here. Very cold weather.
Hmm.
And you learn to, the interesting thing is, hey, Brian, we think, oh, how are we going to adapt? But people have lived here for centuries without the protection that I have in this degree temperature. So it's a
Yeah.
real teaching. You can't complain even if it's 40 below. All you can say it's cold, but
Yeah.
you can't complain. How could I live here? So it's a very stimulating environment, and I've been teaching. Oh, I've been here almost 35 years. Been teaching at the First Nations University of Canada, which is an Indigenous controlled university, and a little bit over at the University of Saskatchewan, and writing. And then the big thing I'm doing now is helping to raise my grandson, who's come to us through a series of unfortunate circumstances. So I'm raising him now with my ex-wife.
Oh, wow.
That's almost sort of what's the key point in my life right now. That's what it is.
Mm. How old is he?
He's going to be turning 8,
Oh, wow.
and so it's a beautiful thing, and I'll never regret the fact that he's come to us. Never. Even though it means a lot of things I don't do. There's so much that he gives,
Mm.
the blessing he gives, that it's just no decision was even made. It was just, of course,
Yeah.
he's our boy.
Yeah.
That's where I am now, and sort of not retired, but officially retired.
Yeah. Well, there's a bunch of things in there that I'd like to ask you about. I mean, one thing I was going to ask you if you were born in Canada, because it wasn't really clear for me from reading Indigenous healing psychology if where you were born. You got your schooling in the States at this little college called Harvard. Um, but I wasn't sure, I was going to ask how a guy from Saskatoon made his way to Harvard, but you were born on the East Coast of the US.
Yeah, yeah. I was born in in Brooklyn, New York, on the sidewalks, and I spent my early years because I was a great sports person, played sports all the time. I had, I guess, two loves in my early life. One was sports, and the other was school.
Was that the time of the Brooklyn Dodgers?
That's where I was, and I used
So,
to go there. I used to walk to Ebbets Field, and I
wow.
saw Jackie Robinson steal home.
Really?
So that was the culture. And every day after school, I'd go out onto the sidewalks on the streets and play what we used to call stickball, which is
Wow.
a broomstick and a Spalding ball. And the sewer covers were the bases. So I grew up in a very kind of, not dense urban, but urban environment. And we used to say, west of the Mississippi is unknown territory.
Hmm.
That was an East Coast bias. I moved further and further west, but as so often is the case, how did I end up here? And it's a relationship. We move so often because of relationships, and
Hmm.
so that's how I ended up here through my relationship with my ex-wife, actually, who was
Hmm.
from here.
Ah, okay.
Yeah,
There's the connection.
yeah,
Yeah.
there's the connection. But we came via Alaska,
Right.
which was a very good transition to a whole different way of living. A lot of people who grow up in an urban environment, it's very different when you move to Alaska and then also here to Saskatchewan. Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. There's got to be some kind of similarity, though, that I'm maybe imagining, having only visited New York and Brooklyn, but I suspect that there's some similarity in the kind of down to earth, direct quality of the people that these places forge. You think?
I think it very much depends on the neighborhood.
Yeah, right.
Where I grew up, it was a pretty tight neighborhood. The same group of kids played every day. And so there was that tightness in terms of people looking out for other kids. But I think it very much depends on the neighborhood. Certain urban areas, it's transitional. I grew up in an area that was not transitional, so it did have that quality. But I think it's could very much be in the other direction. I find Saskatchewan and Saskatoon very different from where I grew up,
Hmm.
and it's much more. I mean, you might experience that out on the island where you live, but it's in terms of the states, it would be what we would call the far west. Montana, um, Idaho, those kind of places. Where it's really land based. And the irony is that it's land based, but here in Saskatchewan, it's the land that was stolen from Indigenous people.
Hmm.
So the farmers who are the settlers, the colonists, they're attached to the land, and we have a very strong farm-based ideology here in Saskatchewan, but it's land that was stolen.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the under theme, but the major theme of my work is to look at the other side of the picture, not the settler side, but the Indigenous side. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such a complex relationship, especially in farming too. Like on my father's side, his grandparents were Mennonites who came over in that big move from Ukraine during the Russian Revolution, and they were suffering all kinds of persecution over there. And so they basically had to escape. And there was already settlements in the prairies in Saskatchewan, particularly. And so they had people who could receive them there and help them get set up. And farmland was being basically given away in
That's right.
northern Saskatchewan. And so that's where my people, or at least one side of my people, come from. And so I have family ties there too. And yeah, it's, I think, if we're kind of awake and conscious, it's something that we always grapple with, our place on this land, and, what to do with this inheritance of ours, this kind of problematic, complicated inheritance.
This is very important to me, Brian, because what I'm doing right now is the book I'm working on right now uh, is trying to look at all the other things I've done, the writings I've done, and the culmination really was that Indigenous healing psychology book. Um, but now looking at what are the implications, the direct personal implications of looking at Indigenous teachings in the context of colonization. So, as a white person, what do I have to consider even more seriously than I ever have? The fact that the teachings that we receive, and I talked about those teachings in the book, came from a context of of suffering, a context of deprivation, a context of pain that I'm seeing more and more clearly is part of the teaching. You know what I'm saying, Brian? It's part of it. So how do I, as a white person, relate to those teachings while respecting the fact that they are, in one sense, unavailable to me because of that seepage of colonization, right? And what is the core that is available to everybody?
Mhm.
Because clearly the creator would not say, I'm sorry, this group of people can't have teachings about spirituality. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
But the particularities of the teachings of Indigenous people, where in that do I have access that's honest and respectful? And where do I really have to say, this is not for me? So that's what I'm working on, Brian. It's kind of like
Great.
it's taken 50 years to come to that point, because my other writing has been, certainly at the request of the people, but not examining as much as I really could have and should have, and I'm doing now, my particular connection. Because oftentimes, and I know you've had the same experience, I was told many times, these are our teachings, we want you to bring them to your people. So it sounds like a simple request. And oftentimes I would take it that way, but it's really much more layered
Yeah.
than I had. And again, I've been at this more than 50 years. So
Yeah.
the request is made honestly, take these teachings to your people. But the layers of what that means are multiple, and
Yeah.
it's not simple. So
Yeah.
that's what I'm working on now. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I mean, I can relate most when I think about yoga and the way that my teachers passed it on, very much with that invitation to practice it first so that you understand it and then share only what you know. Uh,
That's right.
yeah, and I think I was particularly drawn to this lineage where the emphasis is on adapting the principles of the practice to the person's personal background, cultural, mental, emotional, physical, all of that. So it was getting down to that the core of the teachings, like what is actually essential here, what is the kind of distillation of the medicine, and then the way that that is imparted is can be adapted. So we're not taking on a cultural form and just parroting it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and it takes so much work to discover what that essence is. It takes years of engagement with it, of inquiry, of wrestling with it. And then I think what you do find is that there is kind of an archetypal human medicine there in it that you can then see kind of reflected in various different cultural forms. But like you said, I mean, you've been really working on this for over 50 years and you're just now finding out.
Well, grappling with, I mean, it's not that it's never occurred to me, obviously, it's occurred to me frequently, but not taking center stage. You see, the center stage was occupied with trying to understand the teachings and to write about it in a way that had multiple purposes, one of which was to give credibility and authenticity from a Western perspective to a series of Indigenous teachings within that context. And when I was working in Fiji, um, that the teaching there was like, at a certain point in time, it's important for someone from outside the culture to write about what we're doing. There's a place for that. And so that was really my intention in all the writing that I was doing. But now I realize with this new book, this Indigenous Healing Psychology book, that there's also a really important purpose. And I didn't realize when I wrote that book what it's done, but it seems to resonate with people who are training to be therapists, psychologists, social workers, counselors, mostly white people. And that seems to be where it really has found its niche.
Mhm.
And I'm teaching at the university to clinical psychology graduate students. A course we call it Learning from Indigenous Perspectives on Health and Healing.
Yeah.
That's an eye opener for them. And I teach it now each year now. And one of the students, just give me an idea. So mostly white students. I think I've had only maybe in the past 10 years, 3 or 4 Indigenous students, because, you know, clinical psychology in Canada is still pretty much a province of white privilege, right? As one student said after we talked a while, you know, I'm not sure what to do. I don't know. I'm not sure I know anything. And I said, great. That's where we have to go, because I said, there are people who you can turn to who can help you out. I said, in every community, there are elders to work with. And also here in Canada, and I think to a certain extent in the States as well, every person who trains as a clinical psychologist, by and large, almost, I would say probably 90% of them will have most of their clients be Indigenous. Because with our public health system, Indigenous people are way overrepresented. We're at the jails or the mental hospitals, and that's where most of our clinical psychologists will work. So here they are having to deal with a clientele they have no idea about.
Yeah.
So I
Well,
see
it's
now
interesting.
that, yeah,
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I mean that's one kind of segment uh, of the profession. The other part of it, and I don't know, like representationally, where the ratios are at, but like with the kind of private clinical practice, you're probably not going to see too many Indigenous people actually,
this is a very good point. Exactly. But
right? It's a
Brian,
very kind of elitist
yeah, it's
practice.
a small part, isn't it? Hey, Brian, the private practice. I mean, like in terms of clinical work. In the States, it's the opposite way. There's a tremendous amount of private practice work.
Hmm.
But here, I think it's quite the small minority, isn't it?
Uh,
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I mean, and then there's so many kind of like non-licensed therapy going on. So I'm not sure what the numbers would be,
Yeah.
but definitely that's something I want to talk to you about is, well, first of all, you know, it might be helpful to some people to hear a little bit of your background, your training in psychology, and how you came to be exposed to some of these indigenous ways of healing.
Yeah. Well, my background was after university, I decided I wanted to be in a profession. I think it's a long term, to be of help, to help people. Right? It's kind of, a lot of psychologists have that dream. Um, and so I first thought, well, medicine, and I did some pre-med, you know, after graduating from university. Now, how about law school? I went to law school for a semester. Oh, no. And finally ended up in psychology, and applied to the program at Harvard in clinical psychology. I think I had one psychology class. At that time, they thought it was enough. And I just happened to come at a point where the professors were Richard Alpert and Timothy Leary. So these were my professors in the clinical psychology program. So it was a very rare and, I would say, specialized kind of education that I got there.
That's one way to
There were
put it.
other people who were there. Skinner was there, and Harry Murray was there. Gordon Alport was there. Eric Erickson was there, and Eric Erickson was one of my mentors. And the interesting thing about him was he had no Ph.D. in psychology. He was in the psychology department. As a
Yeah,
matter of fact,
I didn't realize that until reading your book, actually. It
yeah,
was
as a
that
matter of fact,
surprised me.
he had no PhD at all. But he taught a course that was really very popular. And he was there for about 3 or 4 years, I think. And then finally, they just said, couldn't take it. Not only was he teaching a very popular course, very popular, but he wasn't a real psychologist because he didn't have his PhD. So it was a very unusual environment. And during that time, we all, a small group of us, I would say probably about 3 or 4 graduate students were involved also with the psilocybin and the LSD experiments or work. We used to sort of not only doing research, but we did our own personal research, taking the substances and so forth. So it was a very eye-opening, but for me, more like a confirmation of that what is out there,
Hmm.
confirmation of that. So from that to a very kind of chance meeting in my postdoc year of a person named Richard Lee, who had worked in the Kalahari for a number of years. He literally, this was in the 60s, remember, a lot of things were going on there. A lot of money was available for research. He literally said to me, are you interested in going to the Kalahari? Because they do healing there and they alter their consciousness, but with no drugs. Oh, I said, that's very interesting. That's kind of where I'd like to go. And that was the beginning of that. And that was in 1968.
Mm.
So it was not like unusual to go. What was unusual is when I got there to realize that here was a place that the culture was proactively involved with changing consciousness. That was the new vision. But going there, it made total sense. As a matter of fact, I remember feeling, sure, I'll go there. It couldn't be any more, how would you say, any more radical than what I've been through already. Psychedelic, you see. But it
Yeah.
was seeing the same intensity of change in consciousness within a cultural context that was normative.
Right.
That was the eye opener.
Yeah.
And then from that point on, hey, Brian, I just realized that if I wanted to pursue these kind of psychedelic visions without the drugs, because I was not interested in pursuing it on that venue, I'd have to kind of be more involved with indigenous communities throughout the world. And that's been the path.
Hmm.
So there, and then Fiji and Alaska and Saskatchewan. And that led to in each case, tell your people about our teachings. Who are my people? Well, at first I thought, sir, white people or Canadians. But then I realized my people really are healers, psychologists, social workers, um, like you,
Hmm.
people like you. You know what I'm saying? So I realized
Hmm.
that, and it really enabled me to be more focused, and that led to the book, which I see as like a culmination of those years of work where clearly the teachings have general application, but very specific and powerful applications for those of us who are committed professionally or personally to the healing work.
Yeah. Well, and committed not only to healing work, but to a particularly anti-colonial approach to healing work, right? Which is who I think are the people attracted to your book.
Right.
People looking to do some decolonization within themselves, but then hopefully then through the practice of
Exactly.
psychotherapy.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I love how you start out the book with an overview of your journey, and all along the way, there's a critical examination of Western psychology, and there are so many things in there that just really highlighted some of the issues with it and the kind of the hidden aspects of colonialism that are kind of embedded in psychology. And I wonder if you could just give people a sense of what you came to understand about it, and then that's where the work needs to be done, right? Which then you followed up on. But if you could just start with, like, what were some of the things you started to notice were wrong with Western psychotherapy and its assumptions?
Yeah, I think that's, you put it really in a good way, Brian, because it's kind of like pervasive and oftentimes invisible, but pervasive. So just to take one example, um, we talk a lot about evidence-based interventions. Is it evidence-based? Meaning, are there studies done to prove that their particular technique X or Y is effective? And they're often called outcome studies. if you look at indigenous healing approaches, which I think are a model of best practices, and I can talk about some of the things like, respect, humility, exchange, um, service orientation that we could use to guide our practice as Western practitioners. But let's go back to the notion of outcome. Outcome depends on there being a measure at a certain point in time, pre and post, that the person entering the treatment benefited from the treatment. And we use that data to say, yes, this is an evidence-based approach, we can use it. The problem with that is it's based on a model of psychology that assumes change can be measured at any particular point, and it can be a measure of change or effectiveness, when in terms of healing, from an indigenous point of view, it's an ongoing process which fluctuates. You could dip into the stream at a certain point and say, oh, this is my outcome measure. But then I'd say to you, but wait a minute, if you had looked a month later or 2 months earlier, you would have seen something quite different. And it never ends.
Right.
From an indigenous. So how could you say it's effective when the person's still alive? Because they'll go through many more changes. So this notion of outcome, which is the rot bed of deciding which treatments are valid and which are not, does not apply to the concept of healing from an indigenous point of view, which I think I don't think it's appropriate to say an indigenous approach to healing. It's a definition of healing.
Right.
It's not just it's a definition of healing. So that's one example where you're fighting against a hierarchy, an institution that's really committed to certain principles that violate the phenomenon they're supposed to be talking about. And it's
Right.
hard, you see, like, like in a graduate program of any kind, the people who run the show are the research people. And the people who run the research people are the quantitative people. I do a lot of advising for theses of qualitative in nature. And what I find is that all the students who are involved with qualitative research, they're trying to show that their research is like quantitative, can be measured in the same way. And then what I tell them is, forget about reliability, forget about measures like that. Those are quantitative. Talk about the quality of the experience, the interaction. So I think that psychology, Western psychology, is so committed to a model that does not allow us to talk about indigenous approaches to healing, which I would say doesn't allow us to talk about healing, that it's a real battle. And this book then, I don't know, it seems to touch a nerve of inquiry of, what should I do? I'm trapped in this kind of box of having to measure, having to count, having to demonstrate with statistics, having to prove my point. And yet I know in my clinical work, it doesn't work that way. With some exceptions, Brian, like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is consistently shown to work in different areas more than other. Well, part of the reason is that cognitive behavioral therapy is structured so that it can be researched. It's structured so there can be an outcome. It's kind of like what would you call it? It's a closed circuit. We are effective, but partly because you're set up to be measured to be effective.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and one of the things that you do point out as well is that, okay, not only is it based on measuring outcomes at one particular point in time of that person's, what is a lifelong healing journey. So that in itself is problematic, but also, how are we measuring success? What is that based on? What are the assumptions that are embedded in that? And I think one of the things you talk about is that it just it keeps perpetuating the status quo. And I couldn't help but think about that Krishnamurti quote that it's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a sick society. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at, is that the measure of a successful outcome is colored by the culture that is setting that standard in a way, right? Which isn't necessarily healthy.
Yeah. And I think that the hidden curriculum or the hidden agenda of training of people to be therapists, counselors, social workers is to maintain the status quo. The people who are setting up the training, the people who are doing the training are part of an establishment that really values its own jobs and job security. They don't want to train people who will break out of the mold, by and large, by and large. And when I'm teaching at First Nations University, one of the things I'm trying to do is to talk about the importance, and this is really, I think, a critical thing. They're almost all Indigenous students. So the first thing we talk about is the importance of knowing the system.
Mm.
You can't just say, no longer, it's all got to be Indigenous. You have to know what the system is. And then with the language of the system, pointing out its boundaries and its limitations. And then you offer the alternative. Because I think that early on it was just, hey, no, we can't do it that way. We must be Indigenous. But that doesn't work anymore. We have to kind of know what it is we're fighting against. And so this outcome point, hey, Brian, is a good one, because think of all the research dollars and all the decisions made on outcome therapy, outcomes of therapy. It's the gold standard. And it's irrelevant, really. Now, the challenge, though, is if it's irrelevant, what's your alternative? You see? And from an Indigenous point of view, the people working in the villages, the alternative is, we know who you are. We've lived together. You have a village, and when I was in Fiji, 150 people. We know everybody. We know whether it works or not. Translate that to a larger, more urban environment. How do we have the knowledge of, does it work? In most cultures, right, there are people whose role it is to talk about the healers. That's their job. You should go to so-and-so, he can do such and such. You should go to such and such, she can do such and such. That's their job. There's like spokespersons. In our culture, Western culture, we don't have that. So what do we have to do? We have to tell people ourselves. And how awkward is that?
Yeah. Got to
Well, you know,
advertise.
yeah. Otherwise, you have no work. But how awkward is that, eh, Brian?
Well, and it's such a competitive environment too that you're
Absolutely.
not getting much of that. Well, for what you're going through, so and so I think would be so much better suited to helping you based on who they are. And, I think you guys would have a good relationship. Like my yoga guru, he started the first yoga therapy clinic probably in the world in Chennai, India. And the way that he would pair up client and practitioner would be based on, he'd meet the client and he'd go, you know what, I think you and this teacher would get along really well. It was always, first and foremost, there had to be the possibility of a caring, reciprocal, respectful relationship, which would then be a foundation for the trust, and then the healing could come. But it was, the core of it was always the relationship,
Yes, exactly.
not the credentials,
Yeah.
not the specialties or anything like that. It was relationship first.
And if you think of it, I sometimes, this is the way I like to think of it and often do. Um, the creator, or however you want to talk about the way in which things emanate spiritually. I use the word creator sometimes because that's oftentimes the people I've worked with. How could the creator or the force that's out there make distinctions between healers so that some people are denied and some people are given access? It's got to be that, like, that should be available for all people. And as you say, it's the match. So there should never be a thing where, well, we can't go to that person because they don't have the rep. Maybe it's a good match.
Mhm.
There's a thing in Judaism, like the notion of the chosen people. One of the things that Danny and I have worked with is this notion of Judaism and Christianity. So Danny says, this is the Danny Muskwa, the elder I'm working with now, and on this new book, and he's featured, of course, in the Indigenous Healing Psychology book. And he's very attracted to Judaism. He was raised as a Catholic, and he says, they really know what they're doing. They're the chosen people. I say, no. If you read the teachings in their initial language, original language, it's you are a chosen people. And that was before I found that out, because I said to myself, the Creator could not choose a people. In every period of time, there are people who are open to working the spiritual path. It's got to be that way. So it is a chosen people, which means that there always is a people or a person who is chosen rather than the. And so I think that the notion of pairing the therapist or the counselor or the healer, I like to use the word healer, Brian. And I tell my clinical psychology students, who are obviously very professionally committed and bound. I mean, to be a clinical psychologist, at least in Canada, is a pretty big deal. Less so in the States, incidentally. But here in Canada, it's a big deal. You guys are healers. And being healers, you're in a long, historically vital tradition of work. And so that label, I think, is very important. And if that's the case, then there should be just lots of possible pairings. How you make them, because I think your point is important. In a situation which is usually institutional, you're working in a clinic, how do you make those pairings? Usually it's just by, I have a free time at 10 o'clock. Right.
Yeah.
But in
Or
indigenous,
I'll take your insurance.
yeah, exactly. Indigenous communities, the pairing is critical.
Yeah.
Because everybody knows who that healer is and who they work best with.
Yeah. That term healer, I mean, my feeling about it at this point in time is that that's something that could be bestowed on you by others, but to claim it myself just doesn't feel right.
This is really, some of the teachings I've gotten is like, they're key things. And this is really why in that book, I think it resonates with people who are trying to learn professionally. Humility. The healing occurs not because of me, but because I have allowed myself to be a channel for the forces of spiritual energy that can enter into a therapeutic relationship. Humility. Vulnerability. I'm not in control of the situation. And of course, in psychology, particularly clinical psychology, that is a key teaching, to be in control.
Yeah.
That's why people love CBT, because you come with the whole thing already laid out. You're in control. Step 2,
Gives,
step 3, step 4,
yeah,
Yeah,
it gives people a real sense of power.
absolutely. Yeah.
You
And
go
then,
learn the technique, you apply
yeah.
the technique, it's proven by science, and wow,
And
isn't
you
this
and you know the
amazing?
steps to take. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because step 4 doesn't occur before step 3.
Yeah.
It's laid out.
But real healing, like you talk about a number of different experiences you had, it's a it's an organic, moving thing. Like the ceremonies are never quite the same, and there's always that opportunity for creator or the mana to come in and do that healing work. And yeah, I think it's the best ones are just in service to that, like the force of healing.
Yeah. And I'm so glad you used that word mana, because in all over the world that I've been, there's always a word for that healing energy. In the Kalahari, Wakan among the Lakota, mana in Fiji. And the interesting thing, of course, it's also applied widely. Like in Fiji, they talk about a good boxer, prize fighter having the mana. So it can slide into kind of a more of a ordinary
Colloquial.
power thing. Yeah. But that notion, but also the notion of service, um, like I'll tell you, I think I talked about that in the book of the way Danny Musco works with his sweat lodge, there are people who do a sweat lodge who take pride in the fact that their sweat is really hot.
Mhm.
And really hot, as if to say, really spiritual, really
Mhm.
real.
More is better.
And what Danny says is the purpose of the sweat lodge that he was taught was to help people to pray.
Mhm.
And in some cases, a person needs it to be very hot, but most often it needs to be encouraging them to pray. And so he says he never tries to make the sweat just as hot as possible. He tries to make the sweat hot enough for the people who are in there to be supported in their prayers.
Yeah.
That's service, you see.
Yeah, I love that. Like hot enough to focus and heighten your attention so that the prayer can be clear and yeah, like the mind clears out so the prayer can come forward, right?
That's
And
right.
that takes a certain amount of going through the ordeal.
That's
Um,
right. Yeah.
yeah, that's
As opposed to Brian, I have a reputation for having a hot sweat.
yeah, yeah,
That's
yeah,
not service. That's pumping up your own reputation. And it's an ego gratification. I have the hottest sweat in the area, but it's not accomplishing the service,
yeah,
which is
right.
to support people's prayer.
Yeah, and it's kind of a macho attitude too that you can find in some of these healing types, maybe the plastic medicine men, like you call them in the book. But there's parallels all over the place. There's the guy with the strongest ayahuasca that'll make you vomit the most or see the most intense visions.
Right.
There's I met a guy once who talked about he had the strongest tobacco snuff, and that would make you like knock you out for a few hours, make you throw up, and um, but I met a healer once in the Amazon, and he told us that my ayahuasca is not for vomiting. It's not even for visions. It's for learning.
There you go.
And I found it to be much more gentle. And then, we had a ceremony on New Year's Eve, and he said, okay, now tonight we'll make the fireworks. And then it was full of visuals and everything, but it was like a special occasion. The rest of the time it was about learning.
This is so, so important. And like, I don't know how you convince people who are new to this, who seem to think that it has to have the fireworks to be real.
Yeah.
And sometimes the fireworks are important, but they're for a purpose rather than showing how powerful I am as a healer. It's because it's necessary maybe to knock down some barriers, but
Sure.
not to pump up my, you know, the interesting about you so talk about the fireworks. I was giving a talk in Puerto Rico, a good friend there, a lecture on this book, this healing psychology book. And quite a few people were there. It was really well received. And at the end, as the end of a talk, you always say,
Yeah. I made it through.
yeah. And I was signing books, which was, I don't know, that's a beautiful experience because what I do if I sign a book, I try to engage the person who's asking to tell me a little about themselves, what it is that what was the connection that they made to the book so I can maybe write something that speaks to that connection. So a long line. And at the end of the line, this guy comes up to me and introduces himself. How did he introduce himself? Not as a healer, but as a shaman. Yeah. Long hair, he was from South America somewhere with his accent, I could tell. And we talked and so, can I have two copies? One for my daughter, he said, and one for myself. Sure. And then he says to me, would you know how you are after a talk, you're sort of like, you're not all there because you're, relieved, you're happy, you feel connected. He said, would you like to try some, and I can't remember what he called it. And of course I don't even know what I said, but I must have presented a thing that said, I'm not saying no. I don't think I said yes. And before I knew it, he had put, what do you call it? Like some kind of tobacco, not tobacco, but something in one nostril. And then
Oh yeah.
before I
So
knew
it'd
it,
be like hape or rape,
Yeah, that's
probably.
right. Yeah, exactly. And then the other nostril.
Hmm. Yeah.
Well, no, I've taken, a lot of substances, but I hadn't for 20, 30 years. But I knew, you have it in your consciousness. Whoa. So here I was in this room in Puerto Rico in the building that was the administration building. So it wasn't even like out of the way. It was in the heart of the properness, right? And I said to my friend, I just got to lie down a little bit. So right on the stage, I was flat out, pretty strong.
Hmm.
And are you okay? Yeah, I'm okay. Just I need to lie down a little bit. And it lasted a good 15, 20 minutes. And then after I got up, clearly I was still in a state. The point though was that this person did it as a way of saying, look, you've talked about all this stuff, can you handle my stuff? It was that kind of a thing. I didn't
Mm.
catch it at the time because I was sort of still in this other world of ease, and everybody was connected, but that was his aim. So that notion of can I outdo you is nothing to do with the person. He was not concerned with me as a person. He was just concerned that he could show me he had stuff that maybe would make me say, hey, I don't know what I'm doing. As I say, it didn't have that because it was just another psychedelic session, you know, but
Yeah.
that was the attitude. And there's a
Hmm.
lot of people who will do that. And those are the people I've tried to stay away from in my work. I've always worked with people who are a little bit more quiet.
Mm. Mm.
In Rosebud, and I talk about this in the book, the person I worked with, Joe Eagle. There are no pictures in the book, but if you had a picture of him, he would look to you and to me and to anyone else just like an ordinary guy. No feathers, nothing. Just wore a baseball cap. That's the kind of guy I worked with, who was very humble. The only difference in all the years I've worked, over 50 years, was Tomajo in the Kalahari.
Mm.
And when I first met him, he was just, hey, look at me, guys. But a wonderful guy. But he was in that vein because he was trying to establish himself in a culture that wouldn't support that, because in the
Mm.
Kalahari, among the Jintuasi, everybody is treated equally, and most of the men become healers. But he had gotten into this kind of Western notion, I have to kind of distinguish myself. I went back there 20 plus years later, and he was just the simplest guy, totally giving. But that one year in 1968, he was the only one I've ever worked with who had that kind of, hey, look at me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
found myself, I gravitate towards that other type. But that's one of the teachings that that humility and service.
Mhm.
With Joe Eagle as an example, like he never talked about his healings, never. And he would talk often about his disappointments. And most of his disappointments were people who didn't follow through
Mm.
with the teachings that Joe, got from the spirits.
Mm.
They didn't complete the
Yeah.
task. So he would talk about his disappointments a lot, but not about how much he achieved.
Yeah. No, that's great. No, I love that story too. I've got a similar one I could share about the,
Yeah.
surprise tobacco snuff experience
Right.
to show off.
Yeah. What? Yeah. It's a manipulation, eh?
Yeah.
To
Yeah.
serve an ego purpose. And if I had not been experienced, who
Hmm.
knows what could have happened? I could have
Oh yeah.
just gone, off the deep end. I was in an environment that was certainly not conducive.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, I was in the administration building, at a university. That's where the heart of the the
Yeah.
heart of the institution beats, you see.
Yeah.
And I was fully, dressed for a lecture, and just let me lay down on the stage for a bit. And I always remember my friend. Are you okay, Dick? Are you? Yeah, yeah, I'm fine. I just need to lie down for a
I'm
minute.
gonna ride it out, man.
Well, and to experience it, you know.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, but both of those, yeah.
Yeah, so I was wondering if maybe you could outline some of the kind of core principles that you've come to, uh, that you've learned from these different indigenous healers. And what I like the way you put it in the book that your goal is to help heal psychology so that it can be a healing psychology. And what you've identified in the book is that it's Western psychology is based on a set of assumptions that are really appropriate to uh, white middle class men and things like that. So you talk about some of what it's lacking and how if we could infuse Western psychology with some of these principles that are inherent to indigenous healing psychologies, that then Western psychology could actually be a holistic healing psychology. I just love the way you frame that. And so if you could offer some of those principles and maybe flesh them out a little bit, that'd be great.
I'd love to. And let me first say that how gratifying it is to hear your words, because when you spend time working on a project, and this project was at least 10 years, it's always nice to hear that. And I'm not taking it personally. I'm not saying I feel good, but I feel that the work that I put into the book maybe makes a difference. So
Hmm.
thank you for those comments. That's really important to hear.
Well, from my perspective, as somebody who is just, kind of organically come into doing counseling work, I never set out to be a counselor of any kind. I wanted to pass on some of the yoga that I had learned that had helped me. And what I found was that when I was giving people one-to-one instruction, which is the way of the tradition that I've grown up in, uh, they would come and we might do some yoga, but often they would bring some of the problems that they were struggling with in their life. And we'd sit there for an hour and we'd talk. And, you know, thankfully it had already been kind of schooled that, well, that is yoga. You don't have to be doing some fancy stretches and breathing exercises.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
So I was already kind of well primed for that, but I recognized that I had a lot of limitations in meeting the kind of the Western mind.
Yeah.
And what I didn't want to do was just kind of only focus on the spiritual. I recognized that I had to meet people where they were at, with these kind of basic life struggles and not pull some kind of transcendence move or something like that. And so then I started to get my schooling and I'm continuing to learn about psychology and different approaches to it. But one thing that's become really apparent to me as I've been doing the counseling work is that the a lot of the therapy and counseling approaches that I've encountered are so clearly to me to be a product of a colonial mindset. And a big part of what I'm trying to do in the work that I'm doing in the world is to decolonize therapy, return it to its communal roots, to kind of democratize, particularly depth psychology, because to me, that's a psychology that doesn't leave out spirit and soul, one of the few. And so that's what I've been working toward doing in my own way and trying to work with mentors who live all over the place. But it's not often addressed so directly as the way that you've done in this book. So I find this book and I'm reading it and I'm cheering along with you as you go through your discovery and talk about your mission. And I'm just like, thank God there's an elder there who's already seen some of these limitations
Yeah.
and is looking to heal psychology and learn from people who were doing just fine by themselves before psychotherapy was invented 150 years
Before it
ago.
was invented. Yeah. Yeah.
Like sometimes I get the feeling like, what did people think we did before CBT? Well, I think our ancestors were doing just fine and they had a lot of things figured out. And maybe if we were humble enough, we could learn
Yeah.
about some of those other ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, Brian, when I went to Fiji, which was in the late 70s, I had been involved with the Gurdjieff work for about 15 years, pretty deeply involved. That was the first and really the only time, other than working with Leary and Alpert, that I was involved with an approach that saw itself as having the answer. This is like we've all been through that. And I'm saying that as a negative comment because, of course, we didn't have the answer. But we had a thing there called movements, which was sacred dances. And I was very involved with that myself. And I remember talking to my teacher, Mr. Island. I'm going to Fiji. How am I going to continue to work with the movements, which require, the direct one-to-one or one to a small class of people to do the various sacred movements? And he said to me, I'll always remember, he says, what are you worried about? He says, you will meet people there who have never heard about spiritual work, have never heard about Gurdjieff, but know more about Gurdjieff's teaching than you or I will ever know. So that notion that spirituality is, and you've said it, just what you said, there's no need, let's meditate. Like I say, look at that tree. Now it's raining out now, it's beautiful rain. And I pray to it each day silently. I hope that your healing is working with that amputated. That's spirit. That's not a big deal, but it's the spirit. So your point that you work where the person is, that's where the spirit is. And that's what Mr. and I always tell me. Just live there, he said. You'll meet people who know about the work. And I've never heard about the concept of the work. Gurdjieff, they don't even know what you're talking about.
Yeah, but if you started to explain what Gurdjieff's work was about, they probably go, "Oh yeah, we do that too," right? It's like when I met curandero in Peru. And I lived in a little dwelling next to where the healers were put up during the retreat, and so I got to spend some just kind of regular time hanging out with them on the porch and lots of gossip and smoking of mapacho cigarettes and on the cell phones, just like regular folks, like you said. But I was, a yoga practitioner. I was out doing my yoga on my porch every morning and all of that. And he was talking to me about yoga. And what I was saying is, like, from my tradition, what it was about, it was really about opening the heart. Like, my guru's book was called The Heart of Yoga. And that's really fundamentally what it was about, is opening the heart so that we could be in right relationship with each other and the world. And then there's harmony, there's shanti, there's peace, right? And he was like, yeah. Okay, yeah. Ayahuasca is yoga. It's meant to open us up so we can receive teachings from above and all of that. And it was just, and that inspired me to write a little book called Yoga and Plant Medicine, because I saw so many parallels between what we were doing in the yoga, in what I call real yoga, and what they were doing with the ayahuasca healing work too. So
yeah, I mean, a particular path can be very helpful, but it's not a requirement. For some of us, at certain points in our life, a path is essential. But for many people on the spiritual journey, they are not on a particular set of teachings. They're just living their life. When I worked in the Kalahari, the first time I went there, I was using a tape recorder. This is in all, you mentioned about the book. What is it? I'm just going to summarize some of the things that I tried to talk about there. And I was taping the conversation with Tomajo. And he says to me, basically, what is that you're using there, tape recorder? Well, and I was taping the healing songs from the day or so before and was replaying them. How do you capture those voices? How did you catch us, that you can now? Well, and I said, well, and I tried to describe it, which of course I had no idea what a sound waves. And I just talked about this is the piece of equipment pointing to the mic that catches the sounds. And they've got this, he says, I know all that stuff, which of course I had no idea how he would know that. But he said, but I want to know is how those voices and those people end up in that pointing to the tape recorder. Well, there's sound, and finally I said to him, I really don't know how it works, but people back home know. And he said to me, before we are given anything of power, we're told how it works and how to use it. And I see that for psychology. Psychology is a thing of power. Before you go out, and when I say psychology, I mean like all the work, your work, clinical psychology, that whole social work, the whole area of health and healing. Before we go out, we have to know what it is that we're working with because it's powerful.
Mhm.
So the book is trying to kind of, I would say, be sure we realize how powerful that is, what we're doing, and then to try to understand it. So in my training as a psychologist, the main thing was, could you measure, can you count, can you establish the validity of things by telling me how many are there of that? And are there more of them than the other thing? So counting was critical and still is. And in order to count, you have to quantify. In order to quantify, you have to chop things up into units. Can you imagine chopping up the healing journey into units so we can measure? So that's kind of like what we're fighting against. Plus the fact that there's a institution called psychology, mental health, health services that is convinced that it has the answer and protects its territory. So that's what we're up against. So the notion of working with elders, who I see as our first psychologists, not that they were the original, but they come from indigenous people and all over the world, indigenous people, because every place of the world has been settled by first people.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying there is that the quote unquote psychologist was always a function in every functioning society. It's just
Absolutely.
they weren't called psychologists.
Healers,
Yeah,
every culture.
healers, medicine men,
That's right.
elder.
That's right.
You go
Yep.
and sit at their feet and tell them your problems, and they comfort you
Exactly.
and maybe give you a good little bit of advice, right?
Exactly.
Always a function of any functioning society.
And the advice they usually give is not to do what I say, but to consider what I say. And if it sounds right and you try it and it works, good. If it doesn't sound right, you don't have to try it. The elders I've worked with never say, and do this.
Mm.
Say, this is what you could try. Or they would say, do this. But at the end, they'll say, you don't have to do it. It has to work for you. So elders then, indigenous elders coming from a lineage are our first psychologists. But psychology has a hard time, acknowledging them as psychologists because where's their training, right? So the book kind of talks about elders in different settings and the teachings that they offer. And one of the things is um, there was a conference I went to. It was about 25 healers, traditional healers, and one white guy. That was me. We went around for almost 2 days talking about. One thing I noticed was for 2 days, we went around the circle talking. Everybody was listening. 2 days. And talking about their work and so forth. And the conference was put on by the US government to try to see how can we measure whether indigenous healing is effective. All said, you can come and measure. You can observe certain things you can't observe, but you can observe. But we have to tell you that the heart of indigenous healing is the mystery that must remain. Can you imagine what Western psychology has to say to the fact that the heart of what we're doing can't be understood and certainly measured and being satisfied with that?
Mhm.
It's like, wait a minute, you said you were going to tell us, and now you're telling us that you can't tell us about the heart except to know it, to
Yeah,
experience it. But that's essential.
that's such a good thing
That's
to point
essential.
out. Well, part of my question is like, how did the soul or the spirit get left out of psychology? I mean, it's in the name, it should be there, right? But I think that's exactly what you're pointing to is the reason why. Is because it's a thing that can't be measured and
The,
quantified and
the
proven.
mystery must remain. Look at Jung. I know you're interested in his work. When I was a graduate student, what was eventually the Red Book was just being talked about.
Yeah, there's the murmurings, this book.
Murmurings. And I could tell you that even people like Erickson or Harry Murray, some people who are more Gordon Allport, some people would know those names. Jung was danger because this guy was talking about stuff. Wait a minute, spirit, So Jung, how did people get to be talking about Jung as a part of psychology and the Jungians? What did they talk about? Individuation, the types. They talked about all those parts of Jung that were safe.
Yeah, the ego self access, like the self, not spirit or the God within. Or
All the things that were safe. And
yeah.
all that stuff that Jung did that we now see in the Red Book and stuff like that, that were the heart of what he was doing was never talked about. That was
Yeah, he said
somehow they,
everything else he did in subsequent years came from that experience over
of
2 or 3 years.
of
Yeah.
course, yeah. But there was a I'm not sure it was explicit, but certainly an agreement among Jungians to make him kosher, to make him acceptable, to make him seem like a real psychologist.
Yeah.
So he was trying to, but within limits, because he was a Westerner and he owned that, right? When he
Yeah, and
talked about
he wanted legitimacy too, and so he always put himself forward as a scientist
that's
and
right.
downplayed the kind of Gnostic or mystical elements. You know, he was trying to play the game and get through what he felt needed to get through. You know, he was being strategic, I think, but I think we're past that.
Yeah.
We can be more
So
explicit.
so the mystery
Mm,
remains.
yeah.
And another thing is that what I've learned and talk about in the book is that the purpose of life is to learn. Um, I mean, like here we are, we're spending time together. We're learning a little bit, actually,
Hope so.
but not as if every moment it's got to be learning, but the overall intention of us being here on earth, at least according to the teachings of, is to learn. To learn what? To learn our place in the universe, according to Danny, to learn how we can return to the creator. There are different theories of what we do and what, but to learn.
Mhm.
And
Yeah, and
so
I think like I would distinguish just, and I think you might agree that we're not just learning by picking up more information that we can
mm,
repeat by rote, but learning in the deeper sense of
the
gaining
deeper
wisdom.
sense, absolutely, yeah. But that's the purpose. And then the notion of the circle,
Hmm.
developmental psychology, which is again a big part of psychology, is still involved with a linear model, or at best a cyclical, where you kind of go into these uh, ever increasingly small circles until you reach some point of, and even Abe Maslow, was caught in a hierarchical, um, but what I've been told and what we're trying to do in the book is to talk about the circle, because the beautiful thing about the circle is that at every point in their circle is equal to every other point. There is no top or bottom. I mean, sometimes you'll see a circle graphically, and at the top they might put something, and but the purpose of a circle is to rotate.
Hmm.
So all the developmental challenges that and Erickson was coming to that. There was his wife, Joan Erickson, who did a lot of the work for him and with him, did some work where she talked about the ninth stage. This is after Eric had passed away. And that ninth stage, adding on to Erickson's 8 stages, one went back to all the prior stages to
Hmm.
revisit. So she was bringing in that circular,
Hmm.
so that childhood, adolescence, adulthood, eldership, we tend to think, well, the elders get more respect, but that's not the case. Every stage is a stage to be respected and worked with. So that's an important teaching. And again, the developmental models that we have in Western psychology, being linear helps to measure. This is where you are on the path.
Mhm.
But if it's a circle,
Yeah.
you might be here, but as soon as you turn away, the circle rotates and you're somewhere else. So
Mhm.
all places are of value, which is really important teaching.
Yeah. The other thing I get from that too, circle being the universal archetype of wholeness, following Jung, um, anywhere you are in the circle, everything else is always present.
That's right.
So in
That's right.
my middle-age passage, there's the child is with me, the rebellious teenager, but also beyond that, there's an elder function that, or potential at least, that's in me as well.
Yeah.
All of those things being present at any given point of the journey. Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolute. And for example, there's a ceremony, a healing circle or talking circle, which is often used by people, but it's a ceremony. And in that ceremony, we go around and every person talks without comments from other people. So you're saying each person's point in the circle is of value. So, and then the whole notion that health is more than not being sick. I mean, like,
Hmm.
it has to be, the Western approach is, can we stop sickness? Can we end sickness? Can we alleviate sickness? And by the way, maybe we'll do that by increasing health. But that's not it's not a dichotomy. The absence of sickness is not health. And health isn't the absence of sickness.
Tell me more.
Health is not the absence of sickness. I have never met a person. Have you ever met a person that's 100% healthy
Yeah,
forever?
it doesn't have something going on at any given
Doesn't have
time. Yeah.
something going on. And you know something, hey, Brian, it's easy and it's on, and I don't engage in that, but every teacher that I've heard about has what Jung would call the dark side, the shadow. The
Mhm.
human beings, even if you say they're God inspired or God possessed, they have their dark side. And Jung was absolutely right. The first step in healing is to talk about and confront and understand our shadow. He's absolutely right. So it's not the absence of disease to define health. Health goes along with unhealth. It goes along with balance. Balance is key. But what's the notion of balance? It has to have in it the notion of imbalance, because otherwise there's no balance. Doesn't exist if it doesn't also imply actively imbalance, like the teeter-totter, like,
Mhm.
can you imagine how dull it is to be like 15 pounds heavier than the person on the other end of the teeter? You spend the whole day sitting on the ground.
Yeah.
It's not a seesaw.
Mhm.
You see, so balance inherently has to have imbalance. And again,
Mhm.
that's the notion of outcome we talked about before. Healing and health inherently has to contain ill health and that constant balance at different levels in different permutations, but it's always that dynamic. So it's
Mhm.
got to be that dynamic.
So let me see if I'm following. So would you define health, like, I love that, not as the absence of sickness, no, but it's something more like a balancing of the whole, of the
A
totality.
balancing of the whole. Yeah, yeah. In different at different points, hey Brian, at different levels, in different situations,
Right.
because as we
Understanding that
grow,
there's flux, there's up and down, and the up and down helps us notice the imbalance. So then we can make an effort in the opposite
absolutely.
direction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, like the straight path, I think I mentioned earlier, like as one travels the straight path, and according to Fiji teachings, as a healer, the further along the straight path one gets, the more experienced, the more dangerous it becomes, because it's more challenges to think, oh, I really got it now. And as one goes along in the path, the more people come to you and acknowledge or try to tell you, wow, you're really, and so one gets filled with kind of self-importance. That's the danger zone.
Hmm.
The more people say you've got it, that's the trap of realizing, and that's when you fall, where am I? What am I,
Yeah. And you talk about the straight path in the book, and I think not so much as a kind of renunciate or um, ascetic path, but straight path meaning a moral and ethical
That's
path.
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, it's not aesthetic at all because in Fiji, people full engagement in life. There are no people off in the bush meditating. It's a full
Right.
engagement. Yeah, and then the notion of all my relations, which is that in community psychology, for example, that was a big deal. Community psychology. I remember in the 60s and the late 50s when a group of psychologists who were clinical psychologists felt that what was happening in the streets, not in their office, in the 60s. And they started community psychology, which was trying to, in terms of social justice, we're all connected. And then when community psychology became recognized in APA and CPA as a form of psychology, as a part, it became regularized, institutionalized, and the ties to community and the activity and the vocal, social justice impetus was gone. It was just another discipline. But the basic notion of it was we are all connected. And so one of the prayers that people of a Lakota thing at the end of your work, you say Midakwiyasan, which means all my relatives, which means I'm ending my prayer with an acknowledgement that everything around me is related, including, that tree that sits there, including the ants, including Brian, including my little guy that I'm helping. We're all related, all my relations. And so that challenges psychology brutally because psychology survives on distinctions,
Hmm.
not on connections, but distinctions, because you can't measure something if the essence of what you're measuring is the connections it has with other things, which are then connected with other. You see what I'm saying?
Hmm.
The essence of you have to isolate.
Right.
So mainstream psychology isolates. That's the purpose of the laboratory.
Yeah.
To take it
Otherwise, it's
out of
too
the environment
fractal.
is
You can't
too.
contain it. Yeah.
That's exactly right. See, so you can see
Hmm.
where the whole notion of the indigenous approaches talks for a different concept of measurement. And what's the concept of measurement? One story. One story. Because the teachings I've received, there's no more basic sacred data than one story. Not the survey, not the number of instances to count, but one's story. And one could say, but yeah, but you could lie. I'm sorry, that's your story. Whether it's a
Hmm.
lie or not is only for you to know. So when you hear a story from an indigenous context, you don't say, wait a minute, you didn't do that.
Hmm.
Because at that point in time, that's their story.
Hmm. And
See,
there, even if it's a factual lie, there's going to be a hidden truth in it, and that might be something about their aspirations or their desires.
that's right. That's
And I
right.
mean,
But
what's
yeah,
more true than that?
that's a good point. Exactly. So the concept of lie is based on a notion of truthfulness that's very superficial.
Yeah.
As you say, it could be an aspiration or it could be an attempt to hide, which
Yeah.
we're allowed to do because that's who we are at that point.
Hmm.
And we don't need a psychologist or a counselor to say, wait a minute, that's a lie.
Hmm.
You want to say, tell me more about what you just said. I want to hear more about that. As
Yeah.
opposed to, oh, I caught this kind of lie. I'm going to, it's
Hmm.
my truth or it's my falsehood, which is my truth at that moment. You see, and
Yeah.
our job as therapists is to listen to whatever the story is and to go with the story, to lead with the story, to travel with the story. It'll end up with the person realizing this is a fabrication that I'm doing in order to save this part of my dignity or this part of my feeling of comfort. I
Hmm.
can't face it yet. And
Yeah.
then you say, it's no problem. We have time. Next week we'll talk more. As opposed to I caught you. You see, let's deal with the lie right now.
Yeah. There's another what it's bringing up for me. how we kind of measure health. Would you say that, I mean, is it a principle or a viewpoint in Indigenous healing that one of the markers of individual health is the health of the community? Like, can they ever be separated?
That's a hard one. I mean, in my experience living in different parts of the world, in small communities, I would say yes, that's the case. That it's very hard to separate them because if you're living in a village like I did of 150 people with not a lot of visitors, hmm, it's a unit, and the Kalahari the same way. On reserves, like at Rosebud, not quite that because there's a lot of back and forth, and I think it'd be harder to say what that means in an environment like I mean, Saskatoon, we have almost, let's
Right.
say, 200,000. It's
Yeah.
hard to say. It's hard to say, but I know there must be a connection, but you can see that connection vitally and actually in small communities. So I'm
Well,
sure it's there, Brian, but it's harder to put a finger on it because here in Saskatoon, only 200,000, there are sections, there are pockets, there are communities that are smaller than obviously 200,000 that have degrees of healing and health, and it could be just a dozen people.
mhm. Yeah, maybe what I'm reaching for here is something I don't hear enough about, and it's like in the language, right? So you talked about Maslow, self-actualization. You mentioned Jung, individuation. Um, it's the isolated individual, not accounting for how individual and community or environment, natural environment or otherwise, are interrelated and inseparable. Uh, and so what are is it possible for me to be completely healthy living in a really sick society or polluted environment? I mean, so many of the problems that people come to me with, I think, are just symptoms of living in modernity or in an urban environment and having a disconnection from natural ways of living.
It's Maslow was, he saw it because I worked with him and he was one of my friends as well as a mentor, but he saw himself as Maslow against the world. So he was very concerned with how does an individual fight the battle? He was always fighting the battle. So his emphasis on individual characteristics would be explained in part by his own journey. I mean, he became president of the APA, but he still saw himself as an outsider
Mm.
and people being against him.
That was his
Um,
complex.
yeah, exactly. So he was fighting, the battle. He was fighting the battle. Um, and I think that so much of Western culture feeds that,
Mhm.
say individual. But, I remember very clearly in Fiji, like with the adolescents, they would walk around sometimes in groups, and sometimes one person would sit down and four or five would just sit down right away with them, almost like a flock of birds, how a flock would just,
Mhm.
and I remember thinking to myself, gee, they don't have any sense of their own destiny. What a, group think. But that was missing the point totally. It's not like they were giving up themselves to group think. It's just that they felt connected. I mean, the birds that we see, flocks of birds, they do these incredible swooping around in the sky. And you think that because they're following a leader in a kind of a blind, it's part of the connection. It's what makes the flock,
Mhm.
gives them protection, right, from predators. So yeah, we're affected, but how large the unit has to be, I don't know. And hey, Brian, what choice do we have, eh? I mean, you live in a beautiful spot, but it's part of the world, That's the other
Mhm.
thing I realized. People used to say, oh, you lived in Fiji, what a beautiful thing, you're so lucky. Guess what? It's people. all parts of the world. There's nothing that's beautiful to the point of making you beautiful. You can live in a beautiful environment and be just kind of awful, you know.
Yeah. Well,
That's
and
a,
we see that a lot, how a place will kind of get on the international radar and become a
yeah,
tourist destination.
that's
Next thing you know, Tulum ain't so beautiful
right.
anymore,
Right.
and go down the list of places that have
Yeah,
been kind of ruined by
yeah.
colonial
Well, I used to live
infestation.
a long time ago. I used to live on a little lake when I was living in the States. Beautiful place, just off in the bush. And I used to have someone who came to me to visit. Oh, you're so lucky you live there. I said, why? Well, look at the beautiful lake, and you're right. I said, yeah, but I know I enjoy it, and I'm out on the lake, but it's the same life. It's not solving any of my problems just by being there. So yeah, our environment obviously is part of the deal, but so much of it is out of our control. So we have to just live where we are and to
Mhm.
take that journey.
Yeah.
It's
And try to maintain balance no matter what's going on externally.
yeah. Someone say, "What's your day?" I said, "Do you really want to know?" Yeah, it's been up and down,
Mhm.
and it will always be up and down.
Yeah. How's your day going? Well, it's been going a little like this, little like that, little up, little down,
Absolutely.
little
Yeah.
sideways.
Yeah. And a little sideways. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there are a number of principles that I think are really important. I mean, anyone interested in what we're talking about should read the book. It's like I think it's a textbook for a future course called Decolonizing Psychotherapy in Helping Professions that
I,
maybe
I
we
like
could
that.
talk about later.
I like that very much, Brian. I like that.
um,
Yeah.
but there's one principle that I think we've been talking around a little bit, but I wanted to name because it really jumped out at me, and that's something that sounds like it's inherent to all real healing, at least in your perception. The principle of synergy.
Oh, yeah. Good. Yeah.
Could we
Yeah.
maybe just talk on that before we end?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because I have a book here. I don't know if I should try to get you a copy of it. This one here on
Ah,
synergy, healing, and empowerment. Um, to me, hey, Brian, that's kind of like one of the things that gives me comfort is that, and I believe this, that in the universe, there are principles at work that can maximize connections, can have it so that what's good for one is good for all. And I first saw that in actual work in the Kalahari, where like, if let's say I'm a healer and you're at the healing dance and everybody comes to the healing dance, the whole community. And I do healing work with you, which is, the num comes up and boiling energy and I work on you. The fact of my work on you makes it likely that you're going to work on someone else, or the connection I make with you will activate the connection in another healer. So the notion of synergy, meaning what's good for one is good for all, means there's not a limit to the healing energy, but that it's expanding.
mm,
And if you can set up the conditions, and Buckminster Fuller said, it's out there, so all we have to do is to allow it to happen. But the Western model of you go into an office, you close the door. As soon as you close the door, hey, Brian, no one else can see you.
hmm
It's a limited resource. If we talk about a circle, then it circulates.
hmm
And the work I do with one person makes it more likely another person will be worked on. So the principle of synergy, what's good for one is good for all. And there's an energy that is released, which expands and is renewable.
mm,
I think that's something that if we were allowed to set up structures to let synergy work, would be a beautiful thing.
mm.
And of course, all the institutions that we now use in the Western culture to give us employment are against synergy, because synergy means you can't own things. And if you can't own them, you can't make money from them.
Yeah, again, it comes to that like need to contain in order
Contain.
to
Yeah.
like understand or commodify or
I mean,
yeah,
some people,
control.
yeah, some people are just totally thrown and upset if they can't control.
Yeah.
And control can be sort of made pretty by saying, I have to understand it. Well, some
Yeah.
things you can't understand. I can't understand it, but
Yeah.
that's what it is.
Yeah. And by saying like, I can't understand it, I don't know it, well, you relinquish your authority, you know? Yeah. I love this idea of synergy too. And I was getting the image of something rippling out from
Yeah.
one or two people. And like, not even that, you know, if I work on you, you might work on someone else. But if I do some healing work with you, then you might go home and not kick the dog or yell at your kid or, right?
Right. That's right.
Like
Yeah.
in those little small ways, then the healing ripples out from the
I mean,
individual.
the image, which is kind of we all see, but it's powerful. When you do throw a stone into a body of water and you watch that, it's a powerful image because not only does it cause ripples, but you never see the end. Somehow it's okay, that's it, but it's not. It keeps going, maybe underwater.
Hmm. Yeah. Oh, that's great. Well, this has been, I got to look at the time because I'm sure we could talk all afternoon. I mean,
This is beautiful.
there's
Yeah.
so much to the book, and one of the things I'll leave people with is that it's not a clinical kind of book. It's written in a much different way than most psychology books that I've read. Uh, you write with such a careful respect and humility for the traditions that you're talking about in dialogue with as a Western trained psychologist. That really, really comes through is that humility, respect, and reverence for. And I think the pure intention of what you're trying to do, I really appreciate that and admire how you were able to convey that in a book. Yeah, it's great.
Well, I really appreciate that. And as you're saying that, hey, Brian, I'm trying my best with some success to take it as a comments about the book as opposed to comments about me because it's now in the book. You know what I'm saying? Like I
Yeah,
can't,
yeah.
yeah. But I do appreciate that's a beautiful thing that you've just said. Yeah.
Yeah. So I hope we can have another conversation sometime. It's an hour and a half isn't long enough
Now
to
what?
cover it
Just
all.
reach out, okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. And now I'm
Yeah.
going to pick up my little guy.
Cool.
Yeah.
Um, Now, I don't think you have a website, right?
No, it'll have to be. Can you put up just my email? I
Sure, I'll do that. I'll
yeah,
put
do
up your
that.
email so you don't mind people contacting you directly.
Absolutely. This would be great.
Okay.
Would be great.
And are you doing any online teaching these days?
I do only face to face. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But also you can, if there's a little bit of, different interviews that have been done, on internet and on the web, they're there, but my email, that would be the simplest way.
All right. And the books. I mean, you've
Yeah.
put so much work into the books. So there's a lot there for people if they want to dig a little deeper and learn from you that way. It's
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. Well, this book that we're talking about, I feel good in terms of putting in as much as I could.
Oh,
And
it's in there. And look, you sent me a few years ago, you sent me the hard copy or had your publisher send it. But when I wanted to reread it this go around, I bought the Kindle version,
oh,
which
good.
is great for your book because you have so many footnotes
Oh, yeah.
that are not just informational but anecdotal. Like in
Yeah.
some of those footnotes, you'll get a great little story
Yeah.
about
Right.
about Richard Alpert or
Yeah.
something. So every page there's a few footnotes, and so I'm like I click and it's a little surprise what opens up because it
Oh,
doesn't take you to
yeah.
another part of the book. It just opens up a little window,
Yeah.
and then there's this like really great like kind of insider anecdote about whatever you're talking about.
That's
So I
great. Oh,
recommend that. They've done that really well.
yeah. Well, thanks so much for inviting me. I really
Yeah,
appreciate it. And I hope that people can find the book of some help.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I hope so too. All right. Well, until next time, take care.
Take good care and see you
Yeah.
soon. Yeah.
Cheers.
The Medicine Path is produced by Brian James on unceded Coast Salish territory, Vancouver Island, Canada. For more information, visit brianjames.ca. Music by Olive Artizoni, aka Greenhouse. Join the Medicine Path tribe and gain early access to episodes and the full podcast archives at patreon.com/Medicine Path. May the road rise up to meet you. May the wind be always at your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face. May the rain fall soft upon your fields. Until the next time we meet on the Medicine Path.